Monday, March 26, 1827. A day that will go down in history. Ludwig van Beethoven has died. 3 days later, the people of Vienna flooded the streets. They had come to pay their respects to the man who has written such beautiful music. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 priests blessed the composer's coffin, and the funeral procession left Beethoven's house. The pallbearers carried the coffin through the streets. The crowds were so dense it took an hour and a half to go 1 block to the church. There, in a service lit with candles, the people of Vienna said goodbye. If you looked carefully, you might have spotted in the crowd a boy with a serious face. His name is Christoph, and he is my nephew. And there was a time when he came to know Mr. Beethoven well. It was not a happy time in Christoph's life. His father had died. He was just 12 years old. I was a young man myself, a student of music in Salzburg. Christoph lived in Vienna. He wrote me letters about his troubles. And as you will hear, my nephew had a lot to say.
Dear uncle, something terrible has happened. A madman has moved into our house. His name is Ludwig van Beethoven. Do you remember that when Father died, Mother decided to rent out his offices upstairs? Well, she has done it, and Ludwig van Beethoven has moved in. Every morning at dawn, Mr. Beethoven begins his dreadful noise upstairs. Bumping, pounding, and loud howlings come through the floor. It is enough to turn your blood cold! Mother says I mustn't blame him. He's deaf and can't hear the noise he makes. But he wakes up the twins, and they start crying. They cry all day. All morning, Mr. Beethoven carries on this way. After lunch, he storms out into the street. He hums to himself, growls out tunes, he waves his arms, his pockets bulge with papers and pencils. On the street, the children run and call him names. Hours later, he comes home. Sometimes he is soaked with rain. He tracks mud through the hall, and then, long after the house is quiet for the night, he pounds his way up the stairs above our heads. Uncle, please help. I have no one to talk to. I know we need lodgers, but Beethoven? Uncle, I know I have not seen you for some years, but I hope you will remember me. Uncle, please come. The twins and I need your help. I beg you to tell my mother to send Mr. Beethoven away.
My dearest Christoph, what a delightful surprise to receive your letter last night. Do I remember you? Of course I do, and I miss you very much. I'm so sorry you're finding these months so difficult. I should tell you I received a letter from your mother as well. She is concerned about you and wants you to be happy. She assures me that although Mr. Beethoven is peculiar, perhaps, he is certainly not mad. Believe me, Christoph, I know only all too well how difficult musicians can be. But I cannot come right away. I must be practicing for my concert next week. I'm even playing a piece by your Mr. Beethoven. So be patient, little nephew. I know that life will be more peaceful before long.
Dear Uncle, now everyone is laughing at us. I opened the front door this morning to find a huge crowd in front of our house on the street. They were gathering together and calling their friends to come over and pointing at our house. I was very upset. I snuck out of the house, through the back door, and crept around to the front to see what they were so excited about. They were looking up at Mr. Beethoven's window and laughing, and so I looked up too. There was Mr. Beethoven. He was standing at the window, looking at a sheet of music, and Uncle! He had on no clothes at all! It was a dreadful sight. Sometimes people will stop in front of our house thinking they will see Mr. Beethoven, but if anyone asks, I can say that he has moved away. Dear Uncle, Mr. Beethoven has a friend named Mr. Schindler. He visits him almost every day. He always says, "Poor Mr. Beethoven, he is a lonely man." Uncle, you know that Mr. Beethoven is deaf, but Mr. Schindler says that his eyes are weak as well. When he works too long by candlelight, his eyes begin to ache. Sometimes he sits alone with a cloth wrapped around his head to keep out the light. He sits there in his chair, not seeing and not hearing. He is in a world by himself. Uncle, there is not an hour in the day that I forget that Mr. Beethoven is in the house.
My dear Christoph, today I received 2 of your letters at once. I will admit, Mr. Beethoven does not seem to be an easy guest. Perhaps I can help, though, by saying that as strange as Mr. Beethoven seems, there are reasons for the way he acts. You see, although he cannot hear you when you speak to him, all day long he is composing beautiful music. Because he cannot hear, he must compose this music entirely in his head. He must imagine what it will sound like when it is played by an orchestra, and then write it down. Well, this takes tremendous concentration, and so sometimes I imagine he forgets people are watching. Well, he does not think how very strange he sometimes seems to us. We hear his wild noises and see him waving his arms. But he is listening to beautiful music that he will one day share with us. I've heard he's working on his new 9th symphony. He's writing that for a whole orchestra.
Uncle, I have now seen with my own eyes that Mr. Beethoven is mad, and I will tell you the story in the hopes that you will do something. Last night, when I was getting ready for bed, I happened to look up at the ceiling, and I noticed water collecting there. So I moved my chamber pot underneath to catch the drips. I tiptoed up to Mr. Beethoven's room, peeked in the door. You should see my father's study! Do you remember how tidy he was? Well, now there are papers lying everywhere. On the floor, on the chair, on the bed, which isn't made. There are dirty dishes stacked up, and clothing crumpled on the floor. And another thing, he has been writing with a pencil on the walls. Luckily, Mr. Beethoven did not see me. He was standing in the middle of the room with no shirt on. He was holding a jug of water and pouring it over his head. And he shook his head like a wild animal, and all this time stamping his feet like he was marching or listening to a song. I said nothing to Mr. Beethoven, of course, and ran back down the stairs.
Dear Christoph, oh, you cannot imagine the excitement with which my friends and I read your letters about Mr. Beethoven. Oh, how I wish I could be there. I understand that to you, Mr. Beethoven might be a great nuisance, but to us, he's a hero. We try to imitate him in every way. Even the messy room. Here's a story that might interest you. Just this weekend, we visited the house where Beethoven was born. It seems that his family is well remembered there. People who live nearby still recall hearing music coming from the attic late at night. Christoph, Beethoven was not a happy child. His father was an unhappy man who took to drink. Sometimes at night he would come home long after dark and get his little boy out of bed. He would force him to practice his piano until dawn. And so the little Beethoven would play and play, tired and cold, his face awash with tears until finally, as the sun came up, he would go to bed to the sound of morning bells.
Dear Uncle, Mr. Beethoven has on his desk all sorts of bells. One made of clay, one made of bronze, and two little bells made of silver. Maybe they are his good luck charms. Mr. Schenker told me that when he moved to Vienna, Mr. Beethoven always found rooms in between two churches so that he could hear the bells. Maybe that was the last thing he ever heard. Mr. Beethoven has on his desk 4 ear trumpets as well, but you don't play music on them. They're to help him hear. He puts one end in his ear, and then you're supposed to talk in the other end so that he can hear you! But his nephew told me they don't really work. Mr. Beethoven also has beside his bed a pencil and a little notebook. It's his conversation book, and it helps him talk to people. He asks visitors to write down their questions in the book, and then he answers in his low, gravelly voice. Uncle, I think I am not so frightened of Mr. Beethoven anymore.
Dear Christoph, how much happier you sound. I think I have some news that will make you even more cheerful still. I spoke today with a man who once worked for Mr. Beethoven, copying out music. He told me Mr. Beethoven never stays in a home very long. He moves often as 3 times a year. Imagine, Christoph, since he came to Vienna, he already moved over 70 times. So, your Mr. Beethoven has a restless nature. Perhaps before long you'll have your wish, and quieter people living up the stairs. But, in the meantime, tell me, is it true as I have heard, that Mr. Beethoven has 3 pianos in his room?
Dear Uncle, no, it is not true that Mr. Beethoven has 3 pianos in his room. He has 4. Oh, and you should see them! To begin with, his pianos have no legs. He takes them off so that he can play the piano while he is lying on the floor. That way he can use his whole body to hear his playing through the floorboards. Sometimes he sits sprawled on the floor for hours. He pounds the keys so hard, the ceiling shakes. Someday we are afraid it will all come tumbling down on our heads. Oh, and Uncle, I have even seen him put a pencil in his mouth and rest it on the wood of the piano. That way he can hear his playing through his teeth. It is a wonder his pianos can be played at all. The insides are all stained with ink from the number of times he has knocked over the inkwell with his sleeve, and the strings are all curled up and broken like a bird's nest made of wire. Oh, and Uncle, one more thing. The man who made Mr. Beethoven the ear trumpets also made him a metronome. It's a little wooden box with a stick on it. The stick goes back and forth, and tells people how fast they should play. Dog that lives on our street. I have named him Metronome. He is a small and spotted dog who used to whine and whimper, but I have found a way to stop his crying. Yesterday, he was quite pleased to share my sugar cake from lunch. Then this afternoon, a carriage pulled up.
The prince is afraid of Mr. Beethoven. I believe he's showing him respect. In Vienna, everyone loves music so much that even a prince will tread carefully around a composer. Have you ever noticed how much music there is in your city? I remember the last time I was there. You were still quite small. I went for a walk one morning. In fact, it was that morning I decided someday I would live there. I remember a little square. I could not tell you where it was, but I recall the sight of a small girl chasing pigeons. There were so many birds in the square that as the little girl ran, they all took to the air, beating their wings and creating an awful commotion. I passed under a window and heard a little song come drifting out. As I watched, an old woman nodded her head in time to the tune a student was playing. Later on, as I was crossing the bridge near your house, I heard a military band. I stopped to listen. All of that music playing in one city, and your Mr. Beethoven is responsible for so much of it.
Dear Uncle, spring has come and gone, and now it is summer. The house is quiet because Mr. Beethoven has gone out, so I snuck upstairs to have a look around. Mother playing the piano downstairs as she used to when I was small. She is playing a piece by Mr. Beethoven. It is one of the best she has ever played. I have been thinking about something Mr. Schindler said. He said, Mr. Beethoven works so hard because he believes that music can change the world.
Dear Christoph, Mr. Beethoven may well change the world with his music. I know he will certainly change music for the world. Whenever I listen to his music, I try to remember that even this great man was once young, that he had his heroes like the rest of us. For example, it is well known he greatly admired Mozart. He even wrote some variations on his music. When Beethoven was young, he traveled to Vienna to play for Mozart. He hoped to have lessons. Mozart was most impressed and said to his friends, "Watch this young man carefully, for he will make a great noise in the world before long." Sadly, before Beethoven could return for his lessons, Mozart had died. And so, Beethoven went off to study with old Papa Haydn instead. To this day, people say that Beethoven received the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. My dear nephew, oh, please keep writing so that I can know more about your special guest and my hero.
Dear Uncle, do you wonder where Mr. Beethoven goes in the afternoons? Well, now I know, and I will tell you. You see, it all started because, well, Mother sometimes says that instead of just sitting outside on the front steps all day, it would be nice if I spent some time inside. I used to think she meant it until this morning. I went inside. I thought of something to play with. I rolled up a bit of paper like an ear trumpet. Started to scream. Mother said I hurt her and that maybe I should go back outside and play. So I went back outside and sat in my usual place on the step. Well, then Mr. Schindler came downstairs. He said, "The master needs new pencils," so off I went to the shop. He was gone, and there was no one upstairs, except Mr. Beethoven, who was writing at his desk. I stamped my feet on the floor to get his attention. When he didn't notice, I stamped harder. To the left, I was stamping as hard as I could. Then suddenly he turned around and saw me. He looked surprised, and then he started to laugh. He said, "Why, it's the little gatekeeper." I think we became friends. So then this afternoon, he took me with him on his walk. We walked outside Vienna and into the tall woods, and then past the woods and into the fields. When we had walked an hour or so, we stopped by a little brook. Soon Mr. Beethoven took out his papers and began to make little notes. He completely forgot I was with him. He was humming to himself and scribbling quickly in his little conversation book. And suddenly clouds began to form. And birds started flying in circles above us. The sky became very black, and the wind came up and tugged at our cloaks and pushed the trees back and forth across the sky. Mr. Beethoven looked around and kept humming to himself and waving his arms about wildly.
Dear Christoph, There was a time, you know, when Mr. Beethoven created a storm every time he played a concert. He would sit down with the orchestra to play his music without a single note written out. It was all in his head. And his music was so beautiful that sometimes people would start to cry. Well, Beethoven would laugh and say, "Composers do not cry! Composers are made of fire!" Mr. Beethoven was not gentle with the wealthy people of Vienna who did everything they could to please him. He had rough manners even then. He would turn down their dinners, come late to their dinners. Sometimes he'd be very angry if you were asked to play. I have heard that one grand lady got down on her knees one evening and begged Mr. Beethoven to play. Mr. Beethoven did not even stand up to refuse her. She pleaded, he refused. She pleaded, he refused. Perhaps they were used to his tantrums. Another story. One night when the prince teased him for not playing, Beethoven flew into a rage. He said, "There are many princes, but there is only one Beethoven." If we cannot excuse his manners, perhaps we can explain them. Mr. Beethoven had troubles no one else knew about. Here's a famous story people tell. One afternoon, Beethoven was out walking in the woods with a friend. A shepherd was playing a flute nearby. Beethoven's friend said, "Listen," and stopped to hear the flute. Beethoven heard nothing. He became very confused. How could he compose if he could not hear? For most of his life, Beethoven feared becoming deaf. When he was still just a young man, he began to hear humming and buzzing in his ears. He could not hear high notes. He could not hear soft voices. He became very frightened. He saw all manner of doctors and tried many different cures. He even tried pouring ground nuts and cream in his ears because someone told him it would help. Slowly, but unmistakably, Mr. Beethoven was going deaf. How tragic. How very tragic for a man who creates such pure and noble music.
Dear Uncle, someone has given Mr. Beethoven another piano. And there was a lot of trouble getting it up the stairs. And then last night, he had a party. A lot of people came in and out of his rooms until very late, and the more cheerful they became upstairs, the noisier and more miserable it became for us. Finally, it was impossible to sleep. I got up and walked to the bottom of the stairs. Upstairs, they were very excited about a new symphony. I heard two ladies, and I remembered I had seen them laughing on the stairs. They are called sopranos, because they are the singers who can sing very high. They were singing Italian songs. Nel cor più non mi sento, la la la, sendim sendim, la 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 la, tormento, la 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 la, amor. Suddenly it became very quiet. We heard the same songs they had been singing, but this time played on the piano. Mr. Beethoven was playing. Mother let me listen, standing in my pajamas in the hall. I closed my eyes and imagined I was by a little waterfall where water tumbles down into little streams. Suddenly I was very happy to be staying up late after all. And then something wonderful happened. My favorite soprano came out of the room. Well, at least she is my favorite now. She took me by the hand and led me back into the room. Then she wrote something in Mr. Beethoven's book, handed him the book, and then winked at me. He read her words and said, "Why, certainly. The boy and his mother will have tickets as well." "And so Mother and I will be going to the concert." I wrote, "Thank you," as neatly as I could in his book.
Dear Christoph, so my little nephew is going to the concert? I have important news. I hear Mr. Beethoven feels he is not appreciated in Vienna. He almost agreed to have the very first performance of the Ninth Symphony in Berlin. Imagine that, Vienna's greatest composer taking his latest symphony somewhere else. But so many people begged him to change his mind that luckily he did. Oh, and other news. The orchestra members are complaining about their parts. The players say their instruments aren't nimble enough for Mr. Beethoven's quick notes. All over Vienna, the players are struggling with their task. They know the new premiere of a Beethoven symphony is a great event. They're very proud to be in the orchestra that will play his music first. Mr. Beethoven will even conduct the premiere himself with another conductor, one who can't hear, conducting beside him.
Dear Uncle, the closer we get to the concert, the fiercer Mr. Beethoven's moods become. Caroline, his housekeeper, is leaving to marry the baker next door. She told Mr. Beethoven yesterday, and he became very angry because the concert is just 2 weeks away. He picked up an egg and he threw it at her. Then at lunchtime, she came plunging down the stairs like a scalded cat. She had her hat crushed in her hand and her face was covered in tears. Mr. Beethoven had told her that she was fired. She had used a page of his music to stuff his boots. And I have not helped matters either. Today, when I was in Mr. Beethoven's study, by mistake, I brushed some papers from his desk. They fluttered to the floor. Mr. Schindler gasped. Mr. Beethoven had spent all morning putting them in order. And Mr. Beethoven said, "Well, now I must do work again I have already done." Just when life was getting better, I have ruined things.
Dear Christoph, I have read your letter several times. Mr. Beethoven is famous for his temper, but his moods are not your fault. Imagine how frustrating his life must be. Imagine how lonely to hear no voices. Imagine hearing no birds sing, no wind in the trees, no pealing of bells. Oh, imagine! He hears no music, not even his own. So Mr. Beethoven has a great temper. How could he not? But if you listen to his music, you will hear that his heart is great as well. Too great to be angry for long at an innocent boy.
Dear Uncle, Mr. Beethoven has forgotten the incident with the papers. He squeezed my shoulder in a friendly way when he passed me in the hall this afternoon. Now the house is asleep, and I am alone. But the concert is tomorrow night, so of course I cannot sleep. I think of Mr. Beethoven alone upstairs. I wonder what he's thinking about. I wonder if he is awake tonight like me. Maybe he is hearing something beautiful in his head that we will hear tomorrow. I wonder what it sounds like. She turns him to face the crowd. Up there on the stage, Mr. Mr. Beethoven bowed and bowed again.
Dear Christoph, that was an astounding concert you described. How lucky you are to have been there. It makes me wonder who is more fortunate. We, who can hear, but so imperfectly, or Mr. Beethoven, who cannot hear, but can imagine such perfect music in his head. I realize he moved away soon after the concert. Have you seen him since then? Thank you for your letters, and please give a kiss to your mother and sisters for me.
Dear Uncle, I have seen Mr. Beethoven again. I thought you'd like to hear about it. It was on the street. He was rushing past, humming to himself as always, and I ran up and caught him by the sleeve. He looked surprised at first, but then he recognized me. He said, "Why, it's the little gatekeeper." He took my hand in his. I took his book, and I told him that we miss him very much. And then he asked about Mother, and he was very pleased to hear she's teaching piano again. I asked him if he was well, and he said he would be healthier living away from the river. So I told him that when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor, just like my father, and I will make him better. He read my words, but he didn't say anything. He just squeezed my hand, looked down at the ground, then he patted me on the head, told me to keep well, and walked on. He looked so sad. I wanted to run after him, but I didn't know what to say. I watched him walk down the street until he was out of sight.
Years later, living in Vienna, I found this note among my papers.
Dear Uncle, last night when I heard that Mr. Beethoven had died, I went down to the river and thought about what Mr. Schindler said. Mr. Beethoven wanted to change the world with his music. Maybe he will do it, bit by bit. His songs seem to tell